Joining us now on the Oakland County Megacast as we continue to deal with a fluctuating economy, inflation, changing gas prices, the job market having tons of jobs open, but maybe not all of them being, or a lot of them being filled, is Michael Greiner, Oakland University Assistant Professor of Management, joining us now on the Oakland County Megacast. Michael, thanks for being with us today.
Great to be here, Tyler. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate having you on. Let's start off by talking about the state of the economy that we're in. We've kind of had a lot of fluctuations of late, especially as regards to the impact of inflation on our economy. Let's just talk about what the data is showing right now. What is the state of our economy? Is it in a good spot? Is it trending upward, or is it in a downward spiral? It seems to be we're hearing one or the other.
Well, you're right. We are hearing one or the other because of the fact that this is a crazy time. It's kind of unprecedented right now. I heard a good analogy for the way the economy is right now, which is that imagine when you have a hose that you're filling up with water and you suddenly pinch it to stop it. And there's all this water building up on the one side. Well, when you let go of it, suddenly it's going to spray around like crazy and cause all kinds of trouble. And that's kind of what happened with the economy after we shut it down for COVID. Right now, we're dealing with some very weird indicators. On the one hand, you've got a job market that's incredibly strong. On the other hand, you have an economy that when you look at the gross domestic product, basically the measure of all the activity of the economy, it's actually slowing down and has been for the last 2 quarters. Now, we can kind of tease apart these different measures and try to explain them each in their place. But when you look at them in the aggregate, it just seems like there's this weird situation going on where on the one hand, it seems like the economy is doing well. On the other hand, there's some real issues of concern.
Some of those issues of concern are just looking toward the future, given all the influx of cash that was put into the economy during the bulk of the pandemic, given that the impact of some of that cash, particularly the stimulus checks that went out to individuals and those that end up leaving some of their jobs, and the job market as it stands right now, which continues to be in a situation where there are plenty of jobs available, but filling those jobs for these businesses still continues to be a lot tougher than it had been in the past. How much of an impact is that having on projections for the future of our economy?
Well, the big issue there really is the impact that it has on inflation. When employers need to pay more to people to have them come to work there, then what they'll ultimately end up doing is passing that cost on to their customers, which means increased prices, which then kind of leads to inflation. It's kind of this cycle that you can get yourself into where you have wages constantly going up and then you have prices going up. And we actually refer to this as the wage price cycle. And there's a real concern. That's what the Federal Reserve, frankly, is trying to avoid right now and trying to kind of put a stop to. Because once you get into that, it's very, very hard to undo. And we'd probably need to go into a severe recession before you'd see that undone. I mean, that's what happened in the early 1980s. Many of our viewers probably remember that. But the hope is right now we can kind of slow things down just enough that we won't have inflation going up so much, and we'll kind of get some a little bit more stability into the markets right now. And if we're able to do that without going into a serious recession, then they'll have accomplished what their goal is, which is what they call a soft landing.
We're joined by Michael Greiner, Assistant Professor of Management at Oakland University in their University School of Business Administration, joining us on the Oakland County Megacast. You can find more information on all their programs at Oakland University, including in their School of Business Administration at oakland.edu. That's oakland.edu. For more information, as we continue to talk about the job numbers and inflation and really just the continued impact that inflation has in all sectors of our economy. Some people still don't really have a full understanding of what inflation is, how it affects the economy, and beyond that, what do we do to get away from these lingering effects of inflation that seem to have been going on for forever at this point in our current state of the economy. So just give us a little bit of insight. What is inflation? What kind of leads to it? And what can we do to combat it?
Well, you're right about the fact that inflation is kind of a tough situation right now. And what inflation is, by definition, is it's basically an average increase in prices across the board. So there's a lot of talk a lot of the time about, say, for example, gas prices going up, going down, kind of bouncing around. And obviously, we all have to deal with gas prices on a daily basis because we have to go and fill our cars, right? But the when the Federal Reserve, which is the main I guess the controller of our monetary supply, what they do is that they actually look at a measure that excludes things like energy and foods, things that bounce around a lot more, because of the fact that that really can kind of vary from day to day and really take you off your game, I guess, a little bit. Um, the most recent inflation report actually was somewhat encouraging. It was basically flat from last month. In other words, there was no average increase in prices from last month. And that had to do with the fact that a couple of specific items that had been driving inflation, that had been driving the prices up, really seem to have stabilized a little bit. And those include things like the gas prices coming down. I mean, I'm sure, again, everybody's seen it when you go to the gas station. Now you can get gas under $4 a gallon, which is pretty good compared to what we've been dealing with recently. So that has helped. There's also something that's kind of less visible, been a reduction in airfares, for example, and housing costs have also started to stabilize a little bit. And those are things that have really been driving up inflation. But since it's an average, you'll have certain little things that will be jumping way up. And then other things that might not be. And it seems like, depending upon how much you're relying upon those things that increase in price a lot, that inflation might be really high, as opposed to if you're just buying things that where inflation doesn't increase a lot, that it wouldn't necessarily feel so overwhelming. But the reality is that since we've had the COVID shutdown and the bounce back from it, you've had this shifting driver of inflation where at first it was like used cars, if you can believe it, where there was a shortage of used cars and people were buying them up like crazy. And because of the fact that there was this shortage of semiconductors resulting from problems with the supply chains, and I don't want to get into all the details there, then all of a sudden used cars were really expensive. And that was driving up inflation, even though it was just one thing relative to this whole basket of goods that people are buying. So you kind of look at this big picture here and how much is it impacting people? Well, it varies based upon what you're buying. But the Fed tries to look at this kind of average basket to see how much it's increasing. Now, what created it, frankly, I'll tell you, I think you intimated to it earlier, is the fact that when we had this COVID shutdown, basically the government sent out a lot of money. So people actually had money in their bank accounts. It's really the first recession we've ever had where people's net worth actually went up on average, and the level of inequality actually went down. It's kind of amazing, actually, when you think about it. Yes, what that meant is afterwards, then there were kind of these supply chain issues. So on the one side, the supply side was kind of jammed up. On the other side, people had lots of money and they wanted to spend it. So you can see where with the supply and demand curve, that old thing that we all learned in Economics 101, suddenly you have a lot of supply, demand is really kind of messed up, and that's going to drive up the prices. And so that's, I think, a lot of what we've seen lately. And there are other little things out there, but I think that's the biggest driver of what's going on. Now, it's worth noting, by the way, that this is a global phenomenon. This is not just something in the United States. But I think that, certainly we've seen it impacted here in the United States as a result of, the policy decisions we made. But, I think it's important for us to kind of bear in mind here, would people really have wanted to do anything differently? Inflation's a bummer now. Don't get me wrong. I'm with you. It is slowing, so that's encouraging. But still, it's way too high. But by the same token, would people have preferred that we come out of this last recession very slowly, with lots of people losing their jobs and losing their homes, the way we did in the last recession? I think generally speaking, people would probably prefer the fact that we did send out the money and that we did kind of take care of people and help them through this recession so that we could bounce back as quickly as possible. But what right now the Federal Reserve is trying to do is that they're kind of trying to slow down demand a little bit by increasing interest rates, and that's what they do. So basically, it makes it more expensive to borrow money to buy things, and that impacts people trying to buy new homes, trying to buy new cars. It impacts businesses trying to expand their businesses. And in so doing, by reducing demand, they hope to kind of even out the supply and demand sides to make it then that inflation isn't going up so much. And that's basically what they're trying to do now.
We're joined by Michael Greiner, Assistant Professor of Management in the Oakland University School of Business, joining us on the Oakland County Megacast. You can find more information on everything happening at Oakland University, including in their School of Business, by visiting oakland.edu. That's oakland.edu for more information. One of the measures that's been taken in order to try to combat inflation was the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act. Among the highlights and provisions in this are the creation of a 15% minimum corporate tax rate, IRS tax enforcement reform as well has been thrown in there. It's been in some comparisons, particularly from Forbes. It's been compared as a smaller version of the president's Build Back Better initiative earlier on in the year. In terms of what this legislation does, how does it go about trying to combat inflation in some of the ways that you had mentioned before that are methods for turning back the clock a little bit on where inflation goes?
Well, here, I think we need to kind of acknowledge the role of politics a little bit because the
Yeah.
reality of this legislation, frankly, and don't get me wrong, I think this is fantastic legislation, but it's not really an inflation bill. There are certain measures that, in the long run, will impact inflation. Namely, that they're going to pay down the deficit a little bit, which that's a good thing, because what that does is it kind of increases what we call aggregate demand, which means that there's not as much money flowing around in the economy. That in the long run will decrease inflation a little bit. Similarly, increasing some of the corporate taxes, that also kind of again takes a little bit of money out of circulation, which that also then decreases demand. But really, those are long-term things. In terms of dealing with the short-run inflation that we're dealing with right now, those really aren't the major impacts of this legislation. The truth of the matter is, this legislation is fundamentally a climate bill and a healthcare bill. And those two things it does incredibly well. And you're right about the fact that it has been called a scaled down version of the Build Back Better bill. But what's the most amazing about this legislation is how it is almost the entire climate program that was originally proposed as part of the $2+ trillion Build Back Better bill untouched. I mean, it's almost the whole thing. Similarly, that's the case for some of the controls that they now have, where they're able to negotiate Medicare drug prices, which that also could potentially reduce some costs as well. So that's very good. Basically, what you see kind of stripped out of the Build Back Better bill were things like a lot of the social spending programs, things like child care and educational support, and getting rid of student loans, things like that. A lot of those things have been taken out of the legislation, but what we were left with really was a very, very good environmental piece of legislation and healthcare piece of legislation.
Yeah, just to back up what you said on this not really being much of an inflation targeted piece of legislation, a nonpartisan research based organization at the University of Pennsylvania, according to an article in Forbes, had said, and this is the Penn Wharton budget model, had said that it has low confidence, and closed quote, in the legislation having any impact on inflation whatsoever. We're joined by Michael Greiner. He is an assistant professor of management at Oakland University's School of Business, with us on the Oakland County Megacast. Michael, a few more minutes with you before
Sure.
we'll say goodbye today. Another part of the Inflation Reduction Act that's been making a lot of headlines this week is the amount of money that's also been put forth in that bill going toward the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS. In particular, about $45 billion for enforcement alone. There are some reports that are saying that the IRS may hire upwards of 87,000 additional agents in order to combat discrepancies in taxes and go after those that maybe have not been correct on their taxes or have been evading taxes in some ways or others. Is that report? We've heard reports that that's going to happen. We've heard other reports that the IRS is not in fact going to hire any new people, or that they're not going to go after those in the middle class. What do you know about this issue? And if the IRS does add more agents, who may that mostly affect in the U.S.?
Well, I think the best way I've heard the IRS described at one point was by a friend of mine who talked about it as being a collection agency. And when you look at it within that window, you have to remember, what are they going to go after? They're going to go after the places where there's the most money. I know that it feels to most of us in the middle class that, we're being taxed to death. I mean, I feel this, I hate seeing that tax money taken out of my check as much as the next guy. The reality is that what we're dealing with is small potatoes here. The kinds of things that the IRS is going to be going after are the multimillionaires, multi-billionaires, large corporations that aren't paying what they're supposed to. And the reality is that this is actually kind of a correction what they're doing here, because for the last 10 years or so, there's been an effort among some circles in Congress to try to essentially starve the IRS, to make it as difficult as possible for the IRS to try to collect on what it's owed. Now, you have to remember, most of us pay what we owe. Because of the fact that we have jobs. I'm sure that you, like me, we have a job, we get a paycheck, the money for our taxes is withheld from that job. So we basically pay everything. The people who are at issue are the people who own for businesses, for example, and they're able to essentially hide how much they're paying, and they don't have it just taken out of their paycheck every 2 weeks because of the fact that they don't get a paycheck every 2 weeks. That at the end of the year they kind of do this thing with their accountants where they figure out, oh, this is how much profit I made, this is how much my expenses were, and so this is how much I owe, and then they try to massage that as much as possible to pay as little in taxes as possible. And it's hard to blame them, but we have a situation now where things have gone too far over to one side because of the fact that now they're able to get away with this stuff, and there's nobody guarding the hen house. There's nobody watching to make sure that these people, even though they are allowed certain tax deductions, that they're not overdoing it or claiming too much. And so as a result, it's pretty clear based upon most studies that there are billions, and I mean billions of dollars that are not being collected that could easily be collected if we just had the enforcement efforts. And that's really what this legislation is targeting. Any kind of talk about it, going after the middle class or anything. I mean, we pay our taxes, it gets taken out of our paycheck every 2 weeks. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about big business. They're talking about people who own major assets. If you're not one of the top 1% or even top 0.1%, this is not going to affect you.
Michael, we appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.